Welcome to my channel, Brainies. Today we are going to discuss about the topic cerebral cortex. Let us just discuss the cerebral cortex briefly. What are the lobes of the cerebrum? Before that, let me just give an introduction about the brain. The central nervous system. The central nervous system includes the brain and the spinal cord. The largest part of the brain is the cerebrum. What are all the lobes of the cerebrum? There are lobes which includes the following: frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe and occipital lobe. These are the location of the lobes of the cerebrum. You could see the picture. It is frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe and occipital lobe. Exactly how are we just going to locate each of the lobes? So we are just going to draw an imaginary line, two imaginary line. The first imaginary line has been drawn from a perpendicular line starting from the parieto-occipital sulcus running towards the pre-occipital notch. This is considered as the first imaginary line. The second imaginary line, which runs at the midpoint of this first imaginary line and runs backwards and then meets the temporal lobe, that is the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus. So the second imaginary line starts from the midpoint of the first imaginary line, runs backwards and touches the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus. With the help of these two imaginary lines, we can just segregate the lobes of the cerebrum separately. So now coming back to the frontal lobe lies anterior to the central sulcus. The central sulcus is the mid portion of the brain which separates the frontal lobe and parietal lobe. So when we see the boundaries of this frontal lobe, it lies anterior to central sulcus and on the top, that is just above the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus. Coming back to the parietal lobe, the boundaries of the parietal lobe, it lies behind the central sulcus, that is posterior to the central sulcus. So the posterior aspect of this parietal lobe, this is the anterior aspect of the parietal lobe and this is the posterior aspect of the parietal lobe, which is being covered by the first imaginary line till the midpoint. And inferiorly, this parietal lobe is being bounded by posterior ramus of lateral sulcus and the rest half is being covered by the second imaginary line. And coming back to the occipital lobe, it lies entirely behind the first imaginary line. And then last but not least is the temporal lobe. It has been bounded just below the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus and the second imaginary line. And this temporal lobe is bounded behind, that is posteriorly, by the first imaginary line, that is starting from the midpoint to the pre-occipital notch. With the help of this first imaginary line and second imaginary line, we can easily segregate the portions of each of the lobes of the cerebrum. So this is the picture depicting the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe and temporal lobe. You could see the frontal lobe lying anteriorly and occipital lobe lying posteriorly. The parietal lobe in between the frontal and the occipital and temporal lobe little below. This is the diagrammatic depiction of the lobes of the cerebrum. So each of the lobe on either side of the right hemisphere and left hemisphere are connected in the center. You could see the various creases in the diagram. These creases are the sulcus or called as the sulcus of the brain. In between the sulcus, you could see a gap, a portion of space in between the various creases. Those spaces or gaps, we call it as gyrus. So each of the right and left hemisphere of the brain consists of various sulcus and the gyrus. So this is the same picture. These are the various sulcus and gyrus present in each of the lobes. So this is the frontal lobe, this is the temporal lobe, here you have the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe. So each of the lobe you could see very clearly in this picture. So each of the lobe consists of various sulcus and gyrus. Let us just see what are all the sulcus which is present. So you could see it in this diagram, the center one, that is in the center portion, the one which is lying in the center, that is called as a central sulcus. You could see in this diagram. So this is the central sulcus that is lying in the center one, and the sulcus just parallel to this, anteriorly there is one sulcus anterior to the central sulcus, and there is one sulcus which lies posterior to this, that is we call it as post central sulcus. So this is the central sulcus, this is a pre-central sulcus, and this is a post-central sulcus. As I've told you before, the sulcus consists of gaps in between, so those things we call it as gyrus. So this is termed as pre-central gyrus and this is termed as post-central gyrus. So coming back to the lobes in the frontal, so you have the frontal sulcus, two sulcus. You could see the sulcus in the upper portion and sulcus in the lower portion. So here we call it a superior frontal sulcus and here we call it as inferior frontal sulcus. Just similar to that, already I've just told you the gyrus. So the one which is on the top of the superior frontal sulcus, this portion we call it a superior frontal gyrus, and this portion which lies middle, that is in between the superior frontal sulcus and the inferior frontal sulcus, this portion we call it as middle frontal gyrus, and just below the inferior frontal sulcus, this portion we call it as inferior frontal gyrus. So there are two sulcus and three gyrus in the frontal lobe: superior frontal sulcus, inferior frontal sulcus, and the superior, middle and inferior frontal gyrus. This is already I've just told you, this is a pre-central and post-central sulcus and pre-central and post-central gyrus. So coming back to the temporal lobe, so temporal lobe, just similar to your frontal lobe, you have the superior temporal sulcus and the inferior temporal sulcus. In between you have gyrus, so you have superior temporal gyrus, middle temporal gyrus and inferior temporal gyrus. So these are the sulcus and gyrus which is present in the temporal lobe. Moving on to the parietal lobe, I'll show it to you in the diagram. So this is the parietal lobe. You have the superior parietal lobule and inferior parietal lobule. In between you have the sulcus which is called as intraparietal sulcus. This intraparietal sulcus divides into superior parietal lobule and inferior parietal lobule. So coming back to the sulcus which is present in the occipital lobe, you have the transverse sulcus and the lateral occipital sulcus. So you could see it in this diagram clearly. So this is the transverse occipital sulcus, the same diagram. Here it is, you could see the diagram. This is superior frontal sulcus, inferior frontal sulcus and three gyrus. Coming back to the temporal lobe, it is superior temporal gyrus, middle temporal gyrus, inferior temporal gyrus and two sulcus, it is superior and inferior. Here it is intraparietal sulcus dividing the two, which is the superior parietal lobule and inferior parietal lobule. Coming back to the last but not least, this is the occipital lobe which lies behind the first imaginary line. So it consists of the transverse occipital sulcus and the lateral occipital sulcus. So these are the two sulcus. You could see it in the diagram. This is the transverse occipital sulcus which is situated in the uppermost portion, and the last one which is the lateral occipital sulcus which is situated in the lowermost portion, and lunate sulcus which is situated in a vertical format. So these are the three sulcus which is present in the occipital lobe. So I hope so you would have understood about these things. So let me just show you this particular picture which consisting of the entire portion. Okay, and the other one, there is one more gyrus which has been left out. This is the supramarginal gyrus, angular gyrus, which is called as gyrus descendens. This is the continuation of the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus and the superior temporal sulcus. These two sulcus comes and ends in this portion, which has been termed as superior marginal gyrus and angular gyrus. So that's it with the lobes of the cerebrum. Thanks for watching. Thank you once again. Kindly support by subscribing and sharing. Thank you once again.